Hi, everyone. I am Monica Yellowtail. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwin is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to TGC, CY, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at the email I'm going to put in the chat box. As this states, I'd like to introduce this webinar as our TGC project. Presenting with us, I have Diane Gout and Morgan Hawes. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat box or click the hand icon. I will now turn it over to Morgan Hayes and Diane Gout. This project is supported by grant number 15JOVW 21GK02197 STOP, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in the publication program exposition are those of authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of U.S. Department of Justice.
And we'll now turn it over to our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Gout. I am the co-principal and owner of Gray Oak LLC consulting business. I've been working with tribal communities for the last 25 years around data collection and evaluation. And I've worked in the field of violence against women for about 35 years now. That's where I started. I am calling in from Massachusetts, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Wampanoag. And I am going to let Morgan introduce herself, who is the other co-principal of Gray Oak and also has the privilege of being my daughter. So let's give it a minute.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're having a few technical issues on this end. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here today to support this work through these webinar series. I am an enrolled member of the Picayune Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians in Oakhurst, California, and I now live in Massachusetts. As my mother said, I work with her doing evaluation, support, consultation, policy development, through Gray Oak, and I'm also a part-time doctoral student in the School of Public Policy, and my work is focused on the intersection between sexual violence and reproductive justice for in Native women. So that's my heart work, and I'm excited to be here again to help everyone learn a little bit more about how to tell their story with data.
Thanks, Bo. Okay, can we go to the next slide? And the next one. There we go. Okay, so this is a 4-part series, and this series starts with really sort of setting the groundwork and the framework for how we think about data collection and program evaluation and project evaluation. And having done this work for a really long time now, one of the things that became really evident to me in that process is that what we're really trying to do and what we need to do are tell stories. Because at the end of the day, you know, we're more than just a percentage. And you know, it's really important for us when we're doing this work around collecting information and reporting that information out, that we begin to humanize our data. And so in order to do that, it's really important that we tell a story. So this is really always where I start when I'm working with programs. I sit down and I ask, what is it that you're trying to do here? What is the story that you want to tell? Are we thinking about, you know, how impactful our work is, how transformative our work is? Are you looking at a particular project that you want to highlight? Are you trying to examine your program as a whole? Are you trying to gather information from your community so that you can tell the story of your community and what your community's needs are, the gaps and barriers, or what you've been able to accomplish? Are you looking at particular policies and trying to see if those policies are making a difference in your community or in your programming or for the people that you are serving? And so in each one of those places, we try to sit down and think about the best way to tell those stories for each of those different places that you're examining, right? And so if we spend a little time with that, we know that all of us that have gotten into this work were sort of propelled into that work. And we were propelled into that work not because the statistics of violence against Native women was high. We were propelled into that work because we heard a story, whether that was our own story, whether that was the story of a family member or a friend or in our community as a whole. But these stories are what sort of propel us to get involved and to take action. And so at the end of the day, that's the thing that I always want to bring people back to is, yes, we have these numbers, but what are these numbers actually indicating to us? What is it that they're trying to get our attention about, and how does that information move us to make changes in whatever work we're trying to accomplish? And so when we think about whether you're doing the work yourself or you're bringing somebody in to do the work, so if you're bringing an outside evaluator into your community, which a lot of programs do, because you know the reality of it is there's not a lot of capacity in programming to be able to do this work, and a lot of times programs don't feel like they necessarily have all of the knowledge they need to do this work. And that's one of the reasons for this series, is that we believe that everybody has the ability to do this. It doesn't require that you have an advanced degree. It just requires that you know what some of the tools are. But one of the pieces around this is if you are bringing someone in, they need to understand all of the racial, cultural, and ethnic views and beliefs of your community, because each of these communities are different and hold their own customs and culture. They demonstrate a desire to listen and learn, so they don't sort of come in and tell you how things are going to get done. They take a step back and they let you guide the process, because at the end of the day, the communities own their data and own their information. They embrace culture, so that understanding that the cultural pieces in each community actually enhances the evaluation and assessment process. And they're making space for everybody to be heard. You know, so when you sit down with them, you want to be clear on, you know, what their values and philosophies are, you know, what they're thinking about. And in a lot of communities I work with, one of the things I'll do is have communities bring an advisory group together. And so that advisory group also will be part of the process of being able to interpret, you know, guide, you know, development of instruments, interpret findings, contextualize those findings in a way that sort of they have the understanding of the community in a way that nuances their data. So in all of those spaces, you know, what we're really trying to do is to really get a good sense of telling their most well-rounded story. Next slide. So why do we want to evaluate? Why do we want to assess? And this has changed a lot over the years, because I see a lot more programs, as I've been doing this for a while, have really started to embrace and move towards doing this work and wanting to take this work on. And I think before there was always that sort of rub between, hey, we want to be able to provide services, and we don't want to have to take the funds that we would provide for services and necessarily move them over to having to do evaluations. And my response to that was always, if we can do the evaluations, and we can demonstrate what most programs already know is how well their programs are working, but you're able to really put that down in sort of, a systematic fashion, so that we can get the funders to acknowledge and to see that information, then that in essence is going to improve your ability to provide services in your community. So, overall, evaluation, it drives learning, and it's one of the most important communication tools that an organization can have, both internally and externally. So yeah, on the one hand, if you're getting federal funding, you need to be able to demonstrate to your funders how well that works, what that funding's doing in your community and for your program. And one of the things early on, I was part of the process to get Violence Against Women Act reauthorized in 2000, and we had to go out to all of the different states and collect data from the different programs that had OVW funding at that time, and come back so that we could submit these reports to Congress about how effective that was. And what they found was most programs didn't collect data in a systematic way where they were able to really demonstrate that, which is hence why the very large reporting forums for OVW were developed by 2005. So in thinking about that is like, when you're collecting that data, what you're really collecting is you're just doing your progress reporting for your funder, and those are your outputs. But an evaluation takes you a couple of steps past that and allows you to determine, and to identify the transformation that occurs as a result of you having this funding and being able to provide these services to the people in your communities that need them. So, it allows you to explore. So what's working well in your community, and where are the gaps and barriers, and being able to sort of look at, these are the things we said we were going to do. This is how we were going to implement this program. Were we able to remain faithful to that process, or did other things sort of occur, like COVID, that interfered with that process and sort of derailed us a little bit? I've got a number of projects where COVID just sort of threw the timeline and the plan completely out the window, and we had to scramble to sort of figure out a new plan. And so being able to be in a sort of a constant phase of assessment allows you to pivot when you need to pivot. As I mentioned, it's going to be that thing that, gets the funding. So it's either going to keep your funding, or it's going to help you secure funding. So if you can write a grant that speaks to the needs of your community and doesn't rely wholly on the national data that's been collected, because in reality, that national data may or may not, most often not, represent the needs of your specific community or what's going on in your community, right? So if you have the opportunity to be able to use your own data, then that's going to be a little more compelling, and that's going to give you that that little extra when you're trying to fundraise or getting additional funding, maybe from foundations or from other state and federal granting agencies. It provides an opportunity for you to strengthen partnerships and to create new partnerships. So, for example, if you're collecting data that says that the survivors you're seeing really don't feel comfortable reporting anything that happens to them to their health services program in the community, whether that's IHS or another health services program. And you sort of explore that and you find, we're hearing this a lot. And some of the reasons is that there some concerns around confidentiality and privacy. then that's information you have now. You've got hard information, hard data that you can take back to that facility and have a conversation and say, hey, how can we work on this? And maybe that creates a new partnership, or maybe that strengthens a partnership, but it may, hopefully puts you on the same path to being able to solve an issue that it's a particular barrier for the survivors you're providing services to. Obviously, in programming, it allows you to develop and improve services for your community. So if you start collecting data on what people are coming in and requesting, and you find, we're getting a lot of people requesting transitional housing. And we don't have a transitional housing program in our community. And you get enough of that information, and it seems in it, and maybe you're collecting it for a year, and you find that it's a really important piece of programming that's missing. Then this might give you an opportunity to develop those services, right? On the other side, you might be hearing from clients that you're doing some maybe some economic advocacy for them, and you're finding out that people really need some job training and or vocational assistance, and that's something that you don't necessarily spend a lot of time on. It might tell you that this is a good place to enhance services or improve services. Or perhaps you see the demographics changing in your organization, and so over the last year, you've noticed that you have more seniors and elders coming in for services. So you take a step back, you put a little pause, and you examine, are our services, do we have them developed to meet the needs of this specific population? And maybe you create a little survey and try to understand what are there definitive needs that an elder population would need that you don't necessarily focus on through your other advocacy services. And so this might be an opportunity, again, for you to improve your advocacy services to be able to meet the needs of a population that's growing within your organization. And then your reporting, I already mentioned this, is that documentation for funders. It's really important that we're able to document that. But the other part is when I used to review these, the data for Muskie, because I probably should have mentioned I was there for 15 years. I helped develop the reporting forms. Is that I always went to the back of where the narrative was to see a little beyond your data, right? Your numbers that you reported, because a lot of times people would talk about how, important it was to be able to have certain services, and that, they were seeing a difference in their community as a result of that. And so, it's that place for you to give that additional documentation, but having an evaluation, it takes you a little bit past just reporting those deliverables and those outcomes. Next slide. So a lot of times when I do this work, people will ask, how do you start this? And I always say, you want to start at the beginning. The sooner you can implement an evaluation process into your work, the better. It's really hard. I know some grants have a requirement now that there's an evaluation of the work. And a lot of times I get a phone call and people are like, we have a 2-year grant, we're supposed to evaluate it, and we have 2 months left of the grant, and we need to know how things went. And I was like, oh, so there's a challenge with that. The biggest challenge being that now we're going to go back and collect data retrospectively, meaning that we're going to have to recall what you did and the services you provided, and we're going to recreate your steps so that we can get to the numbers and all of that. And that's hard. So to the extent that you can, take care of that at the beginning of any of your new projects or your programming, the better, because oftentimes I tell people, I'll ask, what did you eat last Wednesday for dinner? And they're like, look at me like I'm a little nuts, like, huh? And I'm like, exactly. So if I'm ask you what you did 2 years ago, particularly when you've got staff turnover, a lot of organizations have to deal with, then it becomes really challenging. So if you have assessment as part of a requirement, I would say start at the beginning, start really early on as soon as your grant is going, because there are tools which we'll talk about in this series, like logic models and timelines, that can help sort of lay the groundwork, the roadmap, if you will, of getting that done. So the first piece is strategize. So you want to engage your stakeholders. You want to make sure they're all on board. They're going to assist with choosing methods and developing instruments, contextualizing findings, and establishing your next steps. And then prioritizing all of that. So is this a program or a project evaluation? And like I said, it should be woven into the beginning of your project, and then monetizing it. And so you want to make sure you have ample resources. So resources, not just in money, but, in staff time, right? And if you're going to ask the opinions of people, if you're going to do things like focus groups or interviews, then you want to also be able to provide something to those individuals that also are lending their emotional labor to this process. So next slide. So who are the stakeholders? I'm looking at this and I'm trying to understand the whys in the middle. Something happened with our little slide here. So anyone with influence, power, or a vested interest in the information and outcome, and basically those who reflect the diversity of your community. So engaging stakeholders who are connected to the communities, that's a critical first step, because that creates your avenue of trust. So if you're conducting an evaluation and you don't have people in there that represent your community, then you're just doing it on your own. A lot of times they're wondering, well, are those are those findings reliable? Particularly if they're favorable, because people, if any one person ever has something where they think something could be improved and that doesn't get reflected in your findings, they're going to be like, well, they oftentimes think they're the only, they're not the only person. So you want to make sure that you have a nice group. It doesn't have to be a big group. It could be 3 people, 4 people, but you have some stakeholders. And you want to make sure that you provide them with meaningful roles, so that they're just not sort of there. Pardon me. That they actually have a role. And, they're going to help frame questions that you're trying to answer. They're going to help recruit participants. They're going to provide inputs on the methods of your data collection. And again, contextualizing your findings, and getting buy-in is gonna be critical to the success of your evaluation. So if you're doing a long-term evaluation, you want to get commitment up front. So you'd go into the community and you make sure that you're informing the community about what you're doing. You explain how that information is going to benefit them. That should happen with anybody that you're asking information of, but these stakeholders are going to help with that. And part of that process when you're doing that, for example, would be, maybe you want to do some services. You want to understand the needs of youth in your community. So maybe you're hearing or you're seeing some things that are concerning about youth in your community. And so you want to look at how to provide services and assess that. So when you're developing your stakeholder group, you would want to make sure that you had somebody that represented a youth population on that stakeholder group. Same thing as if you were wanting to look at issues around LGBTQIA plus two-spirit individuals in your community. You would want to make sure you had somebody in your stakeholder group that represented one of those populations, because that is going to lend credibility and accountability to their process overall. you might include your community leaders, and those leaders can be either formal leaders or informal leaders. So if you're working to, you want to bring you're going to want the opinions and views of the elder population in your community, then you would want an elder on your stakeholder group. And when you're thinking about that, it's like they might have some leadership there so that they can bring the other people on board and say, this is a good process, you should be involved in it. And they can sort of lend the credibility that you need to get the information from that particular population. So when you're thinking about your leaders, they don't necessarily have to be formal leaders. It helps because, a lot of times if you have somebody there, they can sort of say, hey, this is an important process. I am on a project where we're looking at sexual assault in a particular community, and one of the tribal council members actually put out to all of the agency directors that they wanted their participation in our surveys. So that ended up increasing the rates of survey responses we got. So that can be really important. And then your community programs. So if you're going to be looking at intersections of how your, survivors that you're serving, their experiences with different community programs, maybe it's behavioral health, maybe it's substance abuse, maybe it's childcare, whatever those different community programs are, if it has anything, it intersects with your evaluation and your assessment at all, you would want to invite them to as part of your stakeholder group as well. Next slide. So your stakeholders, when you're thinking about what their role is, that some of the things that they're going to be able to talk about and provide context to is going beyond your simple demographics, right? They're going to be able to sort of round out that story and say, okay, what is the community's history? So they give you some guidance there, and particularly they are essential if you're bringing someone from the outside in to do this work. You definitely want to have a good, strong stakeholder group, because they're going to hold your outside evaluator accountable. And if it's you as a program doing it, they're also going to be able to sort of highlight your blind spots, because, we all have them when we're evaluating our own work and our services. So they're going to be able to provide good context around the community's history. They're going to talk about the traditions and norms that exist within the community. So maybe there's some things going on that you don't necessarily know about, or maybe there's some reasons why people are reluctant to talk about certain topics because, there's some norms around this, right? There's some communities that I've done work with on like harm reduction. And when we've gone in to talk in those communities around substance abuse, the community hasn't been particularly receptive to anything that's not abstinence only. And so from some substance. And so they really weren't okay with like medically assisted treatment. And so having that knowledge allows me to go in and sort of address those concerns, right? If I don't have that knowledge at all, then I'm going in kind of blind, and I don't necessarily, I might be offending people or going into that community and causing harm when I don't mean to. They're going to sort of give you some ideas around the community demographics and trends. So, again, are those demographics changing? Is it trending a certain way? I know, for example, there's a community I've been working with. They've been seeing an increase in gang activity on their tribal lands. And so those are trends that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about some of the, in this particular case, it's a needs assessment. So, in some of those pieces. And then what are the needs and assets? So every community has assets. They have things that are like they do really, really well. It helps sort of serve as a protective factor in a lot of ways. So some of those assets might be maybe cultural gatherings that they hold, and they get a lot of participation in those. People feel very strongly connected to those. Maybe it's just cultural identity is a really strong cultural identity within the community. And so that's an asset. And again, the needs might be, maybe it's a particular community that has a higher unemployment rate, or maybe they've got some housing challenges. And all of those things can play a role when you're doing your assessments. And stakeholders can assist with that. Your next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things, and we'll actually have a more detailed presentation on this, are logic models. And the logic model, if you lay that out at the beginning, after you've got your stakeholder group, and now you're gonna say, okay, so let's lay out our plan, and that plan is your logic model. And the logic model, that provides sort of the roadmap for the work. And really, a lot of times people will do these and they tuck them away and you never see them again. But really, they should be brought out, dusted off, and they should be constantly revisited throughout the life of your project and your program. And they'll change over time. So you can use this as a planning tool. So when you start planning your project and thinking about what you want to do and how you're going to assess that. So in that case, I always start with my outcomes, like what is it that I really want to do? What's the change I want to see happen? And then once I have that, I move backwards, like how am I going to get there? So it's kind of like, I liken it to taking a road trip. If I want to go from Maine to California, which I have family there, so I do that frequently, it's sort of thinking about, so how do I want to get there? Am I going to get there through air travel? Am I going to drive? I've done that a couple of times. If I'm going to drive, which route am I going to take? All of those things. And then how far do I think I'm going to get? All of that's the same thing as a logic model. You do this already in your work that you're doing. This is just putting it on paper. But every program that people have and project, they've already thought about all of these really important pieces. And that's why you've developed your project and your program. And so this is just how you put it on paper. So with this, you also want to create, your timeline and your benchmarks. And each objective that you have, it's going to be measurable. So everything you do is in your work, it's like, how are you going to prove that it was accomplished? And that speaks to your outcomes. So the outcomes really are, what are those changes? And then your outputs are like sort of the products of the work when you're thinking about it. And like I said, we're going to have a whole presentation on this. I love logic models. I think when you first talk about them, they can seem intimidating, but they're actually pretty simple to use, and they make your work flow a little bit easier because you can go back and say, oh, whoops, this is what we had planned. And like I said, on the project I had, when COVID hit, we had to go back and rework the entire logic model as far as our what our activities were going to be. And then we had to rework our timeline. So it gives you something to work with as opposed to sort of having to think about it, theoretically. It's something that's down on paper. Next slide. So then you're going to want to think about what type of evaluation do you want to do? And almost everybody does process evaluations. There are some where they get to outcome evaluations, and then there's short-term outcomes, and then there's longer-term outcomes. But for the most part, the process evaluation is going to look at your activities and your outputs. And this is what most of the time we're doing when we're doing our progress reports, is you're reporting your outputs. So you're saying, what did we do and provide? And those are your services, your training, your community education. And then the outputs, like the specific statement about what was produced. So we did 20 trainings in the past 6 months, or we provided training to 200 participants in the past 6 months. Those are outputs. But it also gives you an opportunity when you're looking at this in terms of the processes, how well are we doing and where did we get sort of hitched up? So if we started and we were doing great, in our grant, we said we were going to hire somebody and we were going to get them trained and then they were going to start providing services. But, when we go and we look at our timeline, we realize we thought we were going to have somebody hired by month 2, but we didn't get them hired until month 5. That is part of looking at a process evaluation, is like, how did the process go when you started laying out the work? And then you're also looking at sort of, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Who is or isn't receiving our services? And then whether or not they're satisfied with the services they're getting. And then your outcome evaluations, those are measurable and they're tied directly to your program activities. So that's, again, a specific statement about what was produced. And then an intended result. So when you're thinking about this, if you're providing a training, maybe you're doing training for professionals in your community, this would take you one step further and say, okay, so let's survey those people that attended the training and find out what new information they have. What did they learn? Are they going to take that information and utilize it? That would be a short-term outcome. And then if you wanted to look at the longer-term outcome, you would say, I'm going to check back with these folks in 6 months or a year, and I'm going to see the information they implemented, what did they see as a result of that? How was it transformative? That would be a longer term outcome, is like following up and getting more details into that outcome process. Next slide. So again, your process evaluation is the number of people served, the types of services provided, how services were received, if they liked them or not, frequency and duration, how long did they stay engaged in services, and any policies you developed. And then the outcome is increase in knowledge, skills, ability, change in awareness, attitude, behaviors, or conditions. And the challenges in that last bullet is that you have to be able to tie that only to your services, and particularly as it relates to changes in behaviors. And what that means is a lot of times in domestic violence programs, we'll see one of the goals is to eliminate violence against women, right? And one, that's really hard for any program to do. So I always recommend against that as a goal, because just as a program by itself, that's an unrealistic goal. That's a community effort. That's going to take something more than just one program. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is tied directly to what you're doing. And then the other thing is you might be providing some services, but then they also might have access to other places, and that change in behaviors or conditions or attitude might not just be a result of your services, but it might also be a result of a collection of things that they've availed themselves to. And so you want to make sure that you that when you're doing your evaluation work, that you're also looking that is this directly linked to just what we're doing, or are we just a part of that process? Next slide. So intentionality, this is a big piece for me. So often I think that evaluation is about balance. So in that process, we walk the line of what we need or want to know with the benefits to the individuals and communities and the systems that we're serving. So, this requires thoughtful consideration. When even when you're thinking about, when you're developing your surveys, it's a bit of an art. And that said, you want to know going in whether this is going to be an in-person, is it going to be electronic, is it going to be a multi-phase, and then knowing your stakeholder group, they're going to assist you with determining this, right? They're going to be able to sort of give you some guidance around that. But the first piece is asking the right questions. So when you're thinking about what we want to know from the people that we're talking to, and that's why it makes it a little bit of an art. So you want to be able to make whatever tool, instrument you're using short enough to keep people invested, and at the same time, comprehensive enough to get the information that you need. The importance of defining your terms, that just can't be overstated. So this piece, and again, we're going to have, I think we have a separate session on survey development, but this piece is really about creating questions that everybody's going to understand the same way. And whether that's a survey, whether that's a focus group, whether that's an interview, you want to know that every single question that you ask, that every person that hears that question is going to interpret that question the same way. This is particularly true of surveys because you don't have an opportunity in a survey to explain, where in a focus group or an interview, you do have that opportunity. If somebody says, well, I'm not sure what you mean, can you give me further information? You don't have that opportunity in a survey. And then, thinking about how culture may influence your questions, and how they're asked. So for example, some cultures, discussing sensitive information while eating isn't appropriate. So if you're doing, focus groups and you provide food, which, is always a nice thing to do when you bring people together, you want to make sure that you're not, if the whole point of them being there is because you want to talk about developing sexual assault services in the community, you probably want to wait until people have finished eating to be able to start having those conversations, because you're not sure what might get brought up. So being particularly aware of what's okay and what's not okay in each community is really important. And then when you're thinking about the numbers versus the narratives, the narratives is really about the why. That's the context piece. So the numbers tell us, one part of the story, but the narrative is what really sort of fills it out and gives it life. It's like, why is this happening? Why are we seeing the numbers that we're seeing? Why are people saying that they do or don't like the services that are being provided? Then that narrative piece is really important to be able to have that. The next slide. So qualitative and quantitative, and again, this is just another way for saying narrative versus numbers, or narratives and number. The different tools, and you've heard me mention them already a little bit, are surveys, focus groups, interviews, pre and post tests. And the selection of your tools should be guided by your stakeholders. Some tools may or may not be culturally sensitive. So, we're not talking about rigorous evaluation projects here where you're looking at tools based on validity and generalizability. But it is important to ensure that the methods and tools are sensitive to your community and appropriate to the population being assessed. So, you don't want things on on an instrument or a tool that, somebody's going to find offensive. And at the same time, you need to use language that people are going to understand. That's the benefit. If you had, like, say, if you wanted to better understand the youth population, you want to make sure that you have somebody there on your stakeholder group. So when you're developing your instruments and you're using the language, they're going to be able to tell you if that's the language that's currently being used. I have a 16-year-old grandson, and I find out all kinds of new words that I didn't know for how they refer to one another. And so, that's a gift. If you can make sure that, again, you have that diversity in your stakeholder group. And then, I was working with one community where they really did not want to talk about sexual assault or sexual violence in a focus group. They really had strong views around everybody sitting around and hearing if there were going to be stories shared. And so we made sure to do interviews in that group, in that community, as opposed to the focus groups. So, you know, again, that's knowing your community, that's knowing what is okay in your community and working with that. And again, if you have somebody coming from the outside, they need to be able to hear and pay attention to that. Also thinking about things like people's political and religious experiences, and you know, that's a piece that has to come into it, because you want to make sure that when you're bringing people together, that when you're making whatever instruments you have as neutral as possible, and they're not relying or leaning into any one of those areas, because again, that can cause problems with your work. And that's more true, I think, as bringing in outside and evaluators to do that. But each of these pieces, you know, with your surveys, your focus groups, and your interviews, that's going to get you closer to understanding your pre and post tests. Most people that utilize pre and post are trying to really understand if a change happened based on the information they delivered. And so usually if I do those, if I do it after a training, it's just to see if their knowledge increased, their awareness increased after the training. But there's ways of doing that where you don't have to do a pre-test as well. And then providing comprehensive technical assistance, that would be another way that you could do it. But again, you know, I think we've sort of started to move away a little bit from pre and post tests and more to just having people reflect on their experiences and their knowledge prior to the training and then after. The next slide. Generally speaking, most of your questions that you're wanting to understand fall into these categories. So you may be looking at these particular things from your side or from their side. So are you seeing, or does your organization have gaps or emerging challenges or reoccurring challenges? Or is your community, are there gaps in your community, the services, and emerging challenges and reoccurring challenges? So, you know, for example, you might identify challenges to engaging community members in utilizing services, but on their side, they may be experiencing challenges, you know, to engaging in their community due to cultural or community concerns. So it could be both ways. And this understanding from both sides, it allows programs to regroup to better meet the needs of everyone. And it's really imperative to know specifically the information you need and to what purpose. So, you know, if we're remembering that every number and percentage point represents a human being in their experience, too often, you know, Native women have experiences of trauma that either themselves or their family, friends, or community. So, you know, we want to make sure that this work is not re-traumatizing and that the information being gathered is necessary and not gratuitous. And again, this is really important when you're engaging outside evaluators. And if you're asking about trauma, you want to make sure that you have a safe place and manner, and that, you know, there's an advocate nearby, because that's, you know, that can be a little bit, you know, some things you don't even expect that they're going to be, you know, that things can come up for people, and oftentimes they will. And so you always want to make sure you have somebody nearby that can provide support if that support is needed. But again, when you're looking at this, you know, your areas that you're really going to be focused on is are there gaps in our services? are there things happening in the community or in our programming that have changed? So we have these emerging challenges. That are there reoccurring challenges? And so a lot of times those reoccurring challenges are going to be things like unemployment or housing issues. Right now, we've got huge inflation going on in the country. And so that just makes things even harder. Everything's just more expensive. And so those challenges in turn sort of filter through everything else, right? What's effective? So always looking at what are you doing really well and thinking about why is that working as well as it's working and how can we replicate that in other areas too. So you might have one part of your programming that's like fantastic, and then another one that's struggling a little bit, and being able to say, okay, what's going on there? So can we sort of tease that out? And then where can we improve? Because everywhere, the goal is we want to improve what we're doing and make it meet the needs as best as we can. So that really, to me, is sort of the place where I'm always thinking about is like, how can we do this better? Is there a way to do this better? Do we have blind spots? Are there things that we need to be looking at that we that we can meet and make sure that the people we're providing services to get the best services that they, that most meet their needs? The next slide. So informed consent. So you probably do this if you run a program. You probably do informed consent when they you're providing services to them, but you should also do this as well for everything else that you do. So if that's around evaluation where you're asking an actual person about their to provide information to you. So it can be pretty simple. It doesn't have to be anything real detailed. But there's a couple of pieces to this that are really important. One is you should always explain why you're asking them this information, what you're going to do with this information, how long you're going to keep that information, what's going to happen to that information after you are done with the evaluation piece that you're trying to assess, and that what the benefits and risks are to them participating in this. And at any time they should be able to withdraw. So if they start doing your interview and then they say, I don't want to do this anymore, or they're engaged in a focus group, they say, I'm not comfortable with this anymore, they should absolutely have the ability to discontinue. And they should be completely provided with the understanding that none of their participation in your services is contingent upon them participating in the evaluation. So people always have the ability to opt out, and their services are not contingent on their participation in anything. So is making sure they understand that. A lot of people don't. So when you ask them to do an to participate in a survey, for example, and they're getting services, they may feel like they have to participate in order to keep those services going. And you just want to spell that out in your informed consent that that's not the case. There's really no reason generally that you have to collect identifying information. And so that is what, when you're thinking about letting them know that if you do have to collect identifying information, that's the piece where you want to tell them why and how that's going to be used, so that they can feel comfortable with that. We want them to have as much information as they can possibly have. But again, it can be something as simple as, participation is completely voluntary and anonymous. The data will be collected to assist in the planning of future education events and to improve services to address the needs of survivors of sexual assault in the community, and no identifying information will be collected. So, doing that, and then they can just, check a box and say they agree to that. They also have the opportunity, evaluators, we hate this, but they have the ability to skip questions that they're not comfortable with. And sometimes from my end of things, that can be a little problematic because, when you're trying to analyze surveys, we hate seeing missing information, but we also understand that not everybody feels comfortable. And so it's really important to honor that. And the next slide. So sort of the difference between confidentiality and privacy. So legislation sort of dictates the confidentiality and privacy pieces. So, you know, you want to make sure that you're familiar with those. I think it's in FIPSA and OVW, the VAWA legislation. So participants must be assured that their information will not be shared in a manner that could identify who they are. This is particularly important for closed or tight-knit communities. So, for example, identifying a participant by the number of children they have and their age might be enough to alert people to their identity. So if you're, you know, putting out information about an assessment you've done, you know, and you've collected data from, you know, maybe it's 100 community members and you've done a needs assessment in that community, and then you want to put some quotes out. So again, we want to humanize our data, right? So we might put some quotes out, and you want to make sure that people are sort of, you know, honored in those quotes. You don't put their name necessarily, but you might say, you know, if a female community member and maybe their age or something like that. That might even be too much depending on what the quote is. But, you know, if somebody says something, you know, and says, you know, during their experience and they've got 5 boys, you know, and they maybe had this experience with law enforcement, you would want to be really careful about whether or not you utilize that information, because maybe there's only one person in the community that has 5 boys. So you didn't have to say their name, you didn't have to say their age, you didn't have to say their gender, but just saying, you know, that they had a person in your community with, you know, 5 boys would be enough for everybody to know who that was. So obviously you have all these other pieces that you don't want to put out, but then again, being able to maintain their confidentiality might mean that there are other pieces of information that you need to protect as well. The difference between, so confidentiality means that, you know, those are the actions where we're going to keep documents, files, and other data away from people or entities that are not meant to see or hear them. So, you know, if you hold a group, a focus group, one of the things I always do when I start a focus group is talk to people about the confidentiality of the group and have people agree to that. So that means, yes, we know who each other is. So therefore it's not anonymous because they can see each other. So that means it's not anonymous, but it can be confidential, which means they're not going to leave the group and tell anybody else who was there or what they said. And then privacy refers to the actions of honoring an individual's right to control who has access to him, herself, and how their information is shared publicly. So privacy means that when we give them a list of things that what they want shared, they get to determine what pieces of information remain private. So if I'm going to use quotes, I will often ask people, I'll send them back to them and say, is it okay if I utilize this information, whether it's for a report or a presentation? In one community, we did a huge a needs assessment in the community, and we took quotes and we posted them up on the walls of a conference center so that people could walk around and actually see the voices of the community represented. And when we did that, we made sure to ask people to see if they were okay, if their quote, and we sent it to them, if that was shared. So that's privacy. It's allowing them to determine what gets used and what doesn't. The next slide. So once you've done all your work, you're going to get to the part where you do the analysis. And so the big thing that I'm going to say here is that it's really important that the data is owned by the program or the community. So if you have somebody from the outside coming in, it's not their data. You need to make sure that's clear up front, that this is the ownership belongs to the community. And what people are now referring to is data sovereignty. That means that you own that, and that anybody else doesn't get to use that data however they choose. If you have someone come in to assist you from the outside, you want to make sure that's in writing, that they understand that the data is to be collected and analyzed as your programming, your stakeholder group determines, and that they can't go back and do anything with that data. And that's happened. It's happened many times, over the years, where really well-known researchers have gone and used data beyond what it was initially intended for, and that causes tremendous harm. So making sure that doesn't happen. So when you're doing that, again, you're going to involve that diverse group of stakeholders so that they can, consider sort of the cultural implications and thinking about how the categories are defined. That they will balance and ensure the accuracy. So if they see something funky, and this is like if you have them going along in the process and you start seeing things. So what we do is sometimes in the middle of the data collection process, I'll analyze some of that data and I'll say, does this make sense? And then that might inform the next phase of data collection. So for example, I was doing a needs assessment in a community, and we started with the agencies that all of the different departments funded under the tribe. And we asked them one set of questions. And when those came back, then I used some of that information to inform how I was going to do the focus groups, which had turned into interviews and then went back to focus groups. But you take that to your committee and say, what are we seeing here? And they're like, oh, well, this and this. And then that might inform how we go forward and do some other changes to maybe our other instruments. So it's really important, like, to maybe have little sections where you pause, examine your data, and then say, okay, well, maybe we want to tweak it here and move forward. Once you've got your data analyzed and you've got your findings, and then your recommendations are going to come out of that. And you definitely want to have recommendations, because it's really kind of silly to do an evaluation and you just sort of stop at, hey, this is what we found. Take it that extra step, say, what are we going to do with this? And I'll talk a little bit about this when I do the survey presentation, but we don't ask questions we're not going to utilize. So if you're going through this whole process, the whole point is to figure out, what do you recommend going forward? Then you want to share and communicate those findings. And, with lessons learned and all of that. And it's really important. I find when I work with the communities is when we go back after we've spent the time sort of extracting the information, then it's the thing, how do you give back? And so when we go in and we say, okay, this is what you said, this is what we heard, this is how we contextualized it, these are some of the recommendations, what do you guys think? How does this hold up? People really, the communities really value that, because you're taking the time to actually say, you gave us this information, and now we're going to give it back to you so that you see that your voices were heard and that your experiences were honored. And then these are some of the things we think that can make some changes. And then it also might be an opportunity to sort of ask them to weigh in on that. Like, does this make sense? And one place we've asked them to prioritize, there were a number of recommendations that came out. And then we asked the community, hey, if you were going to prioritize, what would that look like? And, there's a lot of value in that, because this is work that's affecting them, right? And then if there's going to be implementation of recommendations, then you want to check on those. And if they're not, the recommendations aren't implemented, you want to be able to ask, examine why that is. And maybe there's not enough resources, or maybe capacity has changed and there's been staff turnover. But if you've got a real strong bond in the community that you're doing this work in, then you're going to want to be able to relay that and let people know. Because I've been working with a non-tribal community where people are coming back and saying, what happened with this? Why didn't this, these recommendations weren't implemented, and we want to know why. And the program doesn't really have any, they're not able to answer that because they had a huge amount of turnover. So, make sure that if there are recommendations that come out of your evaluation, that you have a strategy for implementing them. People don't necessarily expect to see that happen immediately or overnight, but they do want to see it happen at some point. So, try to have a plan for that. And then when you wrap up the evaluation, sort of check in with the community. We do a closing. I do closings with the communities that I do evaluations in if we're doing, large scale evaluations. And we bring them together and we check and see how it went for them. Did it, and let it get closed out in a traditional way that reflects their norms within their community. But that sort of keeps them engaged through the whole process. We sit and we go through and we, highlight the benefits. We let them know the lessons that we've learned through it, any challenges we had. And this, for the last couple of years, the big challenge has been, the pandemic. So most people sort of expected that. But even in that process, it was interesting. We were doing surveys. When we pivoted, one of the things that we did in one community was because the tribe was giving food bags out to all of the community members, we attached the surveys to the food bags. And then we provided an incentive. I think it was $100 or maybe $150 for them if they filled out the survey. And so we got, we had really good turnout for surveys, but it was because we were having to sort of, innovate how we could get that out and get the information back so that we could move on with the evaluation. And then make sure that your sort of dissemination is going to meet the needs of the program and the community. So, if you're doing a program evaluation, make sure you find a way to let your program participants know what you found, how you want to get that to them. I did a housing evaluation where they were working with local landlords to get them to provide housing to survivors, excuse me. And they wanted to recruit additional landlords. So one of the things that we developed was a PowerPoint that they could kind of take on the road to the different landlords. And they could, during meetings where they had like a gathering of a lot of real estate agents and landlords and property managers, they could just play the PowerPoint. So it wasn't a report, but it would meet the needs that they had for being able to disseminate the information they found to recruit more potential housing partners. Excuse me. So make sure when you're thinking about it, if it's youth, if you're looking at what's happening with your youth, then maybe you want to come up with some sort of fun way of getting the information to them. But you should always feed the information back, disseminate that information back to whichever community or population that you are asking information from, because that way they feel like they're invested and they're a part of it, and it creates that that accountability and transparency. So it's always going to benefit you in the whole process. And next slide. So again, just sort of summarizing this, your culturally responsive evaluation will include engagement of a diverse pool of stakeholders. Can't stress that enough. Understanding of any potential biases that are there. So if you're evaluating your own work, that's always hard. If you're doing your own program and you don't have a good diverse pool of stakeholders, because, if somebody asks me what kind of parent I am, I'm going to say I'm fantastic. But if they ask my daughter, she might have a different view. So she wouldn't say it out loud, but she might have a different view. So making sure you understand any bias you have. We're always invested in our work. We're invested in the outcomes of our work. So, you want to be able to sort of set those aside. you want to consider how culture is influencing your designs and your method and your evaluation, particularly, in each different community, because each different community has their own cultural norms and their own histories. And so how does that influence what you're trying to do with your evaluation? That multiple perspectives are represented. And if there's more than, it's more than just race and ethnicity and gender. We're wanting to talk about the whole collective of who people are and not just those particular demographics. And then this whole point is for us to use this information to the benefit of our communities, whether that's our program community, whether that's our community overall, but it's to the benefit of our community. So we're not just gathering information for knowledge for somebody outside of the community. It's for us to say how anytime information is being gathered from your community or your program, yourselves, how is it being used and how are we going to benefit from that? Next slide. That's just the reference. And next slide. So thank you. This was really, this is just sort of an overview of all the things to sort of consider when we're thinking about doing, undertaking our evaluation, and how we do that process, and that we're, tell our story and utilizing data for that. And so the other presentations will go, so sorry, more in depth about each of those areas of developing your logic model and timelines and surveys. And you'll get a little more detailed information in those presentations. But are there any questions so far? Are people doing evaluations?
If anyone has any questions or comments, they can put them into the chat box or the Q&A box for us to see. All right, we have a comment here from Olivia. I am hoping to do evaluations after events being planned this year out of our OVW grant.
Oh, that's excellent, Olivia. And we can actually help you with that if you want assistance with, if are you thinking of doing surveys? Yeah, we can absolutely help you with that. So that's also part of this, the work we do with Redwin is if you want, though if you're new, oh good, that means I have somebody I can bend their ear. I love this. We can work with you on developing those surveys to make them as easy as possible and get you the information you need. You would just reach out to Redwin and then they would connect with us. Wonderful. Are there any other questions or comments that people would like to share? Okay, well, I don't know, Hanovi, if you want to close it, I'm good on my end.
Alrighty.
And just letting people know that you can also email us directly if you like. Any idea for people to take? So incentivizing, is it your program, Olivia, or is it, are you talking about the community? Would you, community members who participate? Okay. So sometimes if you're doing the whole community, sometimes what we'll do is drawings. And so we had a lot of success for that, where we would give, if people did the surveys, they got a raffle ticket. And then we had a couple of different gifts that people could win through that were donated, that people could win for participating in the surveys. So that's one way. The other way is if you had, community members, you have a larger community, so it's a little hard to do this, but if you are dealing with a smaller group, then you can do things like gift cards. We did, for some, we did, I think it was coffee cards. We did coffee cards because people like, what was that coffee place? It was
Tim Hortons. I know people like Tim Hortons.
yeah, it was like Tim Hortons, like everybody loved it in this particular area. So we had like little $5 coffee cards that you can give people for coffee. But generally speaking, one is if you're really clear about how you're going to use the information, what I find is a lot of times community members really want to be a part of that process. They want to be able to do good things, have good things happen. Raffles are, yeah. So they'll participate a lot of times for that. But the raffles, I think, are really fun. The other thing is do them at events. If you if people want to collect a large amount of surveys from places, I find they'll do them at some of the events the community has, like if it's a powwow or a particular gathering that they're doing. I know in one, they have a veterans gathering that they do every year. And so they'll, they wanted to get more understanding about the needs of veterans in their community. So they went and they did surveys out there for with that community. The other thing is sometimes you can do focus groups with community members if you have food. And so sometimes the food is incentive to get people to come, and maybe even, you could have like a big picnic or something, or barbecue, and then people will come, and you can have them fill out surveys then too. Are there any questions or other questions or comments? Yes, I do. So the question is, yeah, so I actually started my work with having to do work with youth. So I was part of a juvenile drug court evaluation. And so I actually had to interview youth about their experience in juvenile drug court. And because they were juveniles, I had to get parental consent. So that was fun. So really the big piece about that is being very clear with the parents on what questions you're going to be asking and why you're going to be asking them, and whether or not there's any risks to the children, to the youth. So what's the age group you're looking at? Yeah, so you want to make sure that, again, that the questions you're going to ask a 10-year-old are going to look a lot different from the ones you're going to ask a 15, 16, 17-year-old. So making sure in that place that those questions are nuanced for, that age group. But also when you're talking to the parents, again, it's sort of sitting down with them and saying, this is why, because parents get a little, they're a little more protective, particularly if you're going to ask their child questions, what that can mean for them. The other part of this is I'm not sure what questions you are asking, but another piece is also around mandatory reporting. So being sort of clear on that process too. If that's the risk you run to when you're working with youth, is if anything gets disclosed and you're a mandatory reporter, so sort of know those parameters. And sometimes that can be a piece, if they're not a mandatory reporter, being clear with the parents that that's the case as well. But that's always sort of the challenge, is just sitting with the parents and making them aware of the fact of why you want the information, and letting them see the questions that you're going to be asking. And hopefully they will give their consent, and if they don't, you just sort of move on. My experience with that is that you might answer questions, but if they have some questions, so they're a little concerned, maybe they're wavering a little. But if it's a flat out no, then generally speaking, they're not going to change their minds. Was that helpful? You're very welcome. Any other questions? Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Do you want to close, Hanovi?
Yep. Alrighty. Speaking of surveys, we will be having one at the end of this presentation as soon as it's closed. If you could fill it out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and you can find our other trainings there. And I just want to thank our presenters. I would like to thank our captioner, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a great day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all in the next webinar.